Today we get to start my favorite chapter of this whole course. This is chapter 7, which is going to be all about learning. So we'll start as per usual with a definition of learning. And you're going to find that there's lots of different definitions. So I've tried to encompass a couple of different ones into our definition here. So we can talk about learning as an enduring or durable change in either our behavior or mental processes due to experience. So the key points here are that learning is something that's relatively permanent. We're going to be able to remember what we've learned, and it's going to persist. That change in behavior will persist for a fairly long period of time. It's going to cause a change in behavior, maybe a change in our mental processes, the way that we think. So basically, we are changing what we know. And it's going to occur due to experience or interactions that we have with the environment. So as we encounter things in our environment, we learn what those reactions or what the actions and reactions are going to be from that particular response. So we're going to look at different ways that we can learn from our environment by breaking this down into our different types of learning. This is also probably a good point to note that we mostly determine that learning has occurred by looking for changes in behavior. Because it's really hard otherwise to determine that some kind of knowledge or mental process has changed. So we have to look at what they are doing that's different. And this is especially important for non-human animals, but even if you work with humans, you might encounter a situation where someone says they know something or someone says they can do something, but that's not the same as actually seeing them do it. So our preferred method is to actually measure learning by changes in performance. And so that's most of the data that we're going to look at today. Throughout this chapter, I'm going to talk about 4 distinct types of learning, and we're going to go through each one of these sort of one at a time and kind of build up from the most simple to the more complex types of learning. So we're going to start with event-alone learning, which we can also call habituation. And we usually see habituation paired with sensitization because they're almost like opposites of the same action. And we'll go into the details of that in just a couple of slides. Not all textbooks go into habituation, but it seems to be a relevant thing to discuss here, so I'm going to tack it on ahead of our discussions about the other kinds of learning. These other kinds are event-event learning, so that would be classical or Pavlovian conditioning. And this is when a previously neutral stimulus ends up eliciting a response because you've learned that it's associated with some other stimulus. And we'll go through all of the terms so that these things make sense later on as we've gone through each of these sections. Next, we would have behavior event learning. So that would be instrumental or operant conditioning. So you've already probably heard me talk a little bit about operant conditioning because that's something I have experience with, having done operant conditioning research. So this is when a response becomes more or less likely to occur depending on what the consequences are of doing that behavior. So if something is followed by good consequences, so you do something and you get food, you're probably going to do it more often. But if you do something and then something bad occurs, maybe you do something and then someone yells at you, then you're going to be less likely to do that behavior in the future. That's the basics of operant conditioning. And then the last one we'll talk about is this social learning, or sometimes called observational conditioning. And this is when an observer imitates another person's behavior. And as I said, each of these is going to get its own section that we'll discuss sort of one at a time so that we can have lots of time to go over these and understand all the terms and concepts that go along with them. But before we get into any of these, I actually wanted to take a brief moment and talk about unlearned behaviors. So if we have something that we're born knowing what to do or how to do it, then it really isn't learning. That we could call that thing that we know how to do it, we could call that innate. So it could be something that we are born with, something that is naturally occurring. For scientists, most of the time when we talk about something innate, it usually means that it has a genetic component. Because we've talked about the fact that our behaviors are sort of set up by our genes. We have that genetic component, that nature part of us, and then it's affected by our environment, the nurture part. And so if we have something that we know off the bat, regardless of our experience with the environment, then it's going to be nature only, which means it's a genetic only type thing. At least that's our simplistic view of it. The most basic view of this would be reflexes. And it's unfortunate there are actually two things that we can think of as a reflex, because at the simplest form, a reflex is just some kind of stimulus response relationship, could be learned or innate, that indicates that a behavior happens automatically. So if we refer to something as a reflex, we're saying that it's happening automatically without any conscious interference. So we might be looking at an innate reflex, something that happens because we have an inborn response to it, but we can also see reflexive responses with things that we've learned to associate. We're actually going to see some of these in classical conditioning. So we can learn to produce a reflex when a certain stimulus comes up because you've associated it with the naturally occurring setup. But when we're talking about an innate reflex, we're talking about the very simple and automatic responses that happen naturally without any kind of learning involved. So just keep in mind the context when we're talking about reflexes. I try and only talk about them in terms of the naturally occurring ones. And then when we talk about a learned process, we'll be talking about a conditioned behavior. So we'll use slightly different terminology to try and tell them apart for us. And so for these automatically occurring reflexes, these things we don't have to learn about, we find that a stimulus is going to trigger an automatic response. And one of the simplest versions of this is if you blow a puff of air into an organism's eye, it's almost always going to trigger an eye blink response. So that's an innate reflexive behavior that we do to clear and moisten our eyes. So it helps us prevent dirt from getting on our eyes. It keeps our eyes from drying out. And so you can sort of watch this happen many, many times with all sorts of different kinds of organisms. Now, as you might have figured out, only a very small portion of our behavior is actually going to fall under this category of reflexive behavior. So most of the things end up being learned. And that's why we're going to spend so much time talking about other kinds of learning in this chapter. But we did want to sort of get it out of the way that there is this other kind of behavior, this innate or reflexive behavior that we can talk about. And there are some more complex ones instead of just blinking your eyes. Some of them disappear as we get older, so there's lots of reflexive behaviors in babies. They have those innate grasping behaviors. They automatically cry when they're hungry. If their faces are covered, they'll sort of lift their arms and push downward to clear things off of their face. So those are all different reflexive behaviors that we lose as we get older. But there are some that we maintain even as we're adults. So we'll sort of startle when we hear loud, sudden noises. We'll withdraw very quickly if we accidentally touch a hot object, and things like that. So there are lots of different types of reflexes, some very, very simple, some a little bit more complex. But I just wanted to take this brief little detour to chat about unlearned behavior before we hop into the first of our learning categories, and this is event-alone learning. And so we're going to talk about both habituation and sensitization. So let's start off with habituation, and this is going to be something that sounds just a little bit familiar because we've mentioned sensory habituation back when we were in our chapter on sensation and perception. But here, habituation is going to be in response to behavior. So we're going to call them sort of learning habituation and sensory habituation to tell them apart. But this learning habituation is a process where we respond less strongly over time to a repeated stimulus. And you're going to find when I talk about stimuli, a single is going to be a stimulus and multiple is stimuli. I think I explained that in the sensation and perception chapter, but just in case that's what's going on with that word. And so learning habituation is not the same as sensory habituation. So sensory habituation is a simple form of learning where we have less of a behavioral response to something that's occurring, whereas sensory habituation, that's when the information is going to still be available if it becomes relevant. That's like you don't pay attention to sounds that happen all the time because they're irrelevant, or you go nose blind to scents that are around all the time. That would be sensory habituation, where you're still picking up on those scents, but you're ignoring them because they're not relevant. So you habituate to them at that level. When we're looking at learning habituation, we're specifically looking at some kind of behavioral response in response to a stimulus that's been delivered. And so an example of habituation, the most famous of these, was actually from this sea snail, Aplysia, or specifically Aplysia californicus. So this is a sea slug. These are actually a lot bigger than I maybe would like them to be. So they're up to 12 centimeters long. They can get even longer, which is kind of creepy. But they're important because this was where we discovered the biological mechanism of habituation. So Eric Kandel was studying the sea slug, and they have this sort of slot on their backs. It's a gill, and that's where they breathe. And so when they're in still water, they're going to open up that slot on their back, and they're going to let their gill go out into the water so that they can get better oxygen exchange. If you then go in and poke that gill, if you stimulate it, so the stimulus here would be touch, the snail will withdraw their gill very, very quickly. And so if you do it once or twice, they're going to respond very quickly, very aggressively right off the bat. But if you continue to poke that gill over time, they will eventually habituate to that. And we see less of a withdrawal until eventually, after enough time, there's no response to the touching at all. So because we're looking at that behavioral response, that gill withdrawal response, we know that this is habituation as it comes from learning, as opposed to a sensory kind of habituation. And as I said, we can talk about habituation along with sensitization. And so if habituation is a reduction in our response to a particular stimulus, then sensitization is going to be the opposite. It's an increase in the strength of response to a repeated stimulus. So maybe you have a younger brother or sister, and they know that it's funny to make you jump. They like to scare you. So the first time they do it, they're going to jump out from behind the door when you walk into the bathroom. And so you're going to get really startled. If you were going to habituate to that kind of behavior, the next time they jump out at you, you would be less startled. And eventually you would have almost no response to that behavior or to that stimulus of them jumping out at you. If we go with sensitization, we'd say that instead of getting habituated to that stimulus, you would get more and more scared each time. So maybe the first time they did it, it startled you. And now you're going to be more sensitive to it. And so now you're always watching and waiting for them to jump out. And so when they jump out, you get even more startled. You have a larger response. That would be the process of sensitization. And so this, as I've used in the example, the same stimulus can lead to either habituation or sensitization, just depending on what else is going on. So it can be internal arousal. So that idea of you were scared the first time it happened, so then you had a higher state of emotional arousal because you were waiting for it to happen again. Or it just could be from other factors in the environment. Maybe it's more startling in different situations, but there are ways that it can be sensitized or habituated depending. And then if we wanted to talk about the specificity, so what makes it more likely for us to either habituate or sensitize to a particular stimulus, habituation tends to be highly specific. So you tend to habituate to things that are very unchanging. So if your sibling always jumps out at you from behind the bathroom door, then you learn that the bathroom door is where that's going to happen, and it's not that big of a deal. You're going to get used to it, you habituate to it. But if they jump out from the bathroom door sometimes, and then other times they jump out from a closet, and other times they pop up when you're in your car or whatever, that non-specificity of that presentation can lead to you being more likely to have sensitization. So habituation tends to be very specific to very similar setups, the very same situation and environment, and then sensitization will usually occur if it's non-specific. So just some basic guide rules for that.